My husband brought me a stunning dress from his business trip, and I thought it was just a sweet surprise. The next day, his sister came over, saw it, and begged to try it on like it was her dream. I smiled and let her, watching quietly as she slipped into it and walked to the mirror. But the moment she looked at her reflection, her smile vanished, and she started screaming, "Take it off! Get it off me!" The room froze as panic took over her face. And in that instant, I realized this dress was never just a gift. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating, as I stood by the window watching the street below. My heart hammered against my ribs with a rhythm that felt like a warning, a frantic drumming that matched the terrifying realization dawning in my mind. 5 years ago, I had nearly died in an ICU bed because of a simple chemical dye, and now my husband had handed me a beautiful green box that felt more like a coffin. If his own sister hadn't tried that dress on first, I might not be standing here to witness the betrayal. I looked at the emerald fabric draped over the chair and realized that the man I had slept beside for 11 years was no longer a partner, but a predator. I, Eleanor Mitchell, was 37 years old and had spent the last 5 years of my life building upon the foundation my late mother had laid. I ran a small but thriving chain of 3 pharmacies across the city. The work was demanding, involving endless battles with suppliers, rigorous inspections, and late nights spent over accounting ledgers. I took pride in my success, and the steady income provided us with a comfortable life, a life I thought I was sharing with a man who supported me. Nathan, my husband, was a 41-year-old financial analyst. He was tall, with distinguished graying temples and a practical streak that often bordered on stinginess. In over a decade of marriage, grand gestures were rare. He was the kind of man who counted pennies and preached about the necessity of savings, often dismissing luxury as a waste of resources. So, when he returned from his week-long business trip on a Friday evening with a triumphant smile and a large box tied with a satin ribbon, my initial reaction was one of pure, unadulterated surprise. He had set his suitcase down in the hallway, his footsteps heavy on the stairs because the building's elevator was acting up again. He told me he had a surprise. Inside that box, nestled in thin white paper, was a stunning emerald green dress with a deep neckline and an elegant cut. It was a designer brand, and the price tag, nearly $600, made my jaw drop. He claimed he had simply walked past a boutique downtown during his trip and thought of me, noting that I hadn't bought anything nice for myself in a long time. I was so touched by his apparent thoughtfulness that I missed the warning signs. I kissed his cheek, ignored the faint, sharp chemical odor coming from the fabric, and set it aside, planning to try it on when I wasn't so preoccupied with Monday's upcoming inspections. Saturday morning, Nathan left for the office to finish an urgent report, leaving me alone with the dress. Around 2 in the afternoon, his sister Claire dropped by. Claire was 35, a kindergarten teacher with soft features and a gentle soul who often struggled with her modest salary. We were close, though our busy lives meant we didn't see each other as often as we liked. When she spotted the dress on the dresser, her eyes lit up with a sincere, almost childlike enthusiasm. She begged to try it on, claiming she could only dream of owning something so exquisite. I laughed and agreed, telling her to be careful. A few minutes later, she emerged from the bedroom, the emerald fabric clinging perfectly to her frame. She looked radiant, twirling in front of the hallway mirror. But then, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Her face contorted, and she began to claw at her throat, a dry, tearing cough erupting from her lungs. Panic flared in her eyes as her skin turned a mottled, angry red. She gasped that she couldn't breathe, screaming for me to take the dress off. The zipper was stuck in her panic, and I had to jerk it down with trembling hands. As the dress fell to the floor, Claire collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air. I didn't hesitate. I called an ambulance and rushed to the medicine cabinet. I had to be ready for my own severe allergies, so I always kept antihistamines on hand. I forced a tablet down her throat while waiting for the paramedics. When the medical team arrived, they confirmed it was an acute contact allergic reaction. The paramedic frowned as she inspected the dress, noting a peculiar chemical smell, possibly a dye or a harsh treatment used in the fabric. Claire had no history of allergies, yet this garment had sent her into a respiratory crisis within minutes. After they left, Claire looked at me with pale, shaking lips and told me never to wear that dress. It was only after she left that the cold, hard truth began to settle in my bones. I had a documented, life-threatening allergy to azo group dyes. 5 years ago, a similar reaction had put me in the ICU with anaphylactic shock. Nathan had been there. He had seen the tubes, the monitors, and the fear in my eyes. He knew that certain synthetic dyes were a death sentence for me. My hands shook as I searched for the receipt in the box. When I found it, my heart stopped. The date on the receipt was Thursday, the day before yesterday. But Nathan was supposed to be 1,000 miles away on a business trip on Thursday. He hadn't bought this in another city. He had bought it right here, in our own town, while he was supposedly away. I tried to call him, but he didn't answer. I sent an urgent message, my mind spinning with dark possibilities. I put on rubber gloves, feeling like a stranger in my own home, and sealed the dress in a thick plastic bag, hiding it away on a top shelf. I pulled out my medical records, staring at the words, high risk of repeated shock. Recommended to avoid contact with synthetic dyes. When Nathan finally called back, his voice was irritated, clipped. I told him what happened to Claire. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. He tried to dismiss it, saying Claire was just sensitive and that he hadn't checked the composition of the fabric. But when I confronted him about the receipt and the date, the silence became even more deafening. He claimed he had asked an acquaintance to buy it because he didn't have time. He refused to say who, citing that he was too busy at work to talk. The weight of suspicion was crushing. If I had died, everything I owned, the pharmacies, the apartment, the savings, would pass to him. I had no will. I was young, healthy, and had never thought it necessary to plan for my end. Now, I realized my lack of preparation had made me a target. By Monday morning, I was sitting in the office of David Harper, my family lawyer. David was a man of cold facts and sharp intellect, someone who had handled my mother's estate and my own business registrations. I laid out everything: the dress, the reaction, the lied about business trip, and Nathan's knowledge of my medical history. David didn't look shocked. He looked professional. He told me we needed to protect my assets immediately. He suggested an expert examination of the fabric and a formal report. But more importantly, he told me I needed to eliminate the motive. I had to write a will and execute a power of attorney for my business shares to someone I trusted, my partner, Gregory Barnes. If Nathan was doing this for money, we had to make sure that even in the event of my death, he would get absolutely nothing. The reality of the situation felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I was planning my legal defenses against the man I loved. Later that day, I met Claire at a cafe near her doctor's office. She looked better, but the fear was still etched into her face. When I told her about my allergy and the date on the receipt, she turned deathly pale. She didn't want to believe her brother was capable of such a thing, but the evidence was screaming at us both. We went into the appointment with her allergist, Dr. Rebecca Morrison. The doctor confirmed that the reaction was a classic contact response to a chemical allergen in the fabric. When I asked if it could specifically be the azo dyes I was allergic to, the doctor's expression turned grave. She admitted it was highly likely and agreed to document the connection officially. As I walked out of the clinic, the city felt colder than it had an hour ago. Every step I took felt like I was walking further away from the life I knew and deeper into a world of shadows and secrets. I had the dress, I had the medical reports, and soon I would have the will. I was no longer just a wife or a business owner. I was a woman fighting for her life against a man who thought he could kill me with a gift. The air in Dr. Morrison's office was sterile, but the gravity of her words felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Azo dyes weren't just chemicals, they were the specific ghosts of my past, the very substances that had once stolen the breath from my lungs and left me clinging to life in an ICU. When the doctor confirmed that these dyes were common in vibrant emerald fabrics and recommended a forensic chemical analysis, the last shred of my denial withered away. I wasn't just a suspicious wife, I was a target. I looked at Claire, whose own neck still bore the angry red marks of the dress's touch, and saw my own fear reflected in her eyes. "I'm not going to die," I told her, my voice steady despite the tremor in my soul. "I'm going to fight." The transformation from victim to strategist happened in a blur of legal offices and notary stamps. That same afternoon, I sat in a high-backed chair and effectively erased Nathan from my future. I executed a will that redirected every cent of my pharmacy business to my partner, Gregory Barnes, and left my apartment to a distant cousin. I signed a power of attorney that stripped Nathan of any control over my finances should I become incapacitated. By the time he walked through the front door that evening, I was a different woman, protected by a wall of paper and ink. I pretended to sleep as he entered the bedroom, watching him through hooded eyes. He stood at the door for a long time, a silent shadow watching me, until he finally spoke in that quiet, indifferent tone that usually signaled his annoyance. He accused me of being angry, of playing games, but when I confronted him about the lie, he finally cracked the door to his secrets. He gave me a name, Vanessa. A colleague, he claimed. Someone who understood fashion. But when I demanded her contact information to ask why a designer dress was saturated with chemicals, he retreated into a defensive rage. He called my fear a conspiracy theory and told me to throw the dress away and forget it. That was his mistake. He wanted the evidence gone, but I was going to keep it until it told the whole story. Tuesday morning brought the first definitive crack in his facade. David Harper called me at the pharmacy, his voice tight with professional triumph. The store had responded to our request. The dress hadn't been bought by an anonymous acquaintance with cash. It had been purchased using a loyalty card registered to Vanessa Pierce. She wasn't just a colleague. She was a stylist consultant for a clothing supplier, someone with intimate, professional knowledge of fabrics and chemical treatments. The weight of the situation shifted from a private betrayal to a public crime. David was blunt. This was no longer a domestic dispute, it was preparation for a crime. We met at the police station at 2 o'clock, a gray, imposing building that felt like the only safe place left in the city. I carried the emerald dress in a sealed bag, feeling as though I were transporting a loaded weapon. Inside, I met Detective Marcus Reed. He was a man who had seen everything, yet even he seemed to lean in closer as I recounted the sequence of events, the gift, the calculated lie, the terrifying reaction Claire suffered, and the fact that Nathan knew my medical history better than anyone. Reed took the dress for forensic testing, warning me that it could take weeks. But David and I didn't wait for the lab. We moved to freeze all joint assets. By Friday, a judge had granted the motion. The apartment and our bank accounts were locked tight. When I told Nathan over the phone, his reaction wasn't one of a confused husband, but of a man who had lost his leverage. "You'll regret this," he hissed. It wasn't an apology, it was a threat. He moved out. That night, leaving the apartment echoing with a hollow, haunted silence. The 2.5 weeks that followed were a slow-motion nightmare. I lived like a fugitive in my own home, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. Nathan fluctuated between desperate pleas for reconciliation and cold, vitriolic demands that I stop this spectacle. But David was busy behind the scenes, pulling phone records and surveillance footage. The picture that emerged was sickening. Nathan and Vanessa Pierce hadn't just worked together. They had been in constant, daily contact for 8 months. The phone logs painted a picture of a long-term affair fueled by a shared goal. Then came the call from Detective Reed. "We have the results." Sitting in the precinct office, the air felt thin. Reed opened a thick folder and began to read the cold, scientific confirmation of my husband's intent. The dress wasn't just a factory mistake. The concentration of azo group dyes, the exact substance that triggered my anaphylaxis, was 3 times the legal limit. More damningly, the fabric had been treated with a secondary antiseptic compound, applied unevenly and manually. It was a deliberate enhancement of the garment's toxicity. The dress hadn't just been bought, it had been weaponized. "This is attempted murder," David said, the words hanging in the air like a sentence. I walked out of the station and leaned against the cold brick wall, hot tears finally spilling over. I wasn't crying for the marriage I had lost. I was crying for the woman who had almost been erased for the price of a pharmacy chain and a luxury apartment. I had been married to a man who looked at me and saw a balance sheet he wanted to clear. The following day, Nathan arrived for his interrogation. He looked smaller than I remembered, his skin sallow and his movements twitchy. He sat across from Detective Reed, the recorder whirring between them, unaware that the net had already closed. He started with the same old lies, claiming he had just wanted to do something nice for his wife. He spoke about Vanessa as if she were a casual friend, a fashion expert who had simply done him a favor. He didn't know that the police already had the lab reports, the loyalty card data, and the 8 months of romantic texts. He didn't know that the emerald dress he had so triumphantly brought home was now sitting in an evidence locker, ready to send him to prison. I watched from behind the glass of the observation room, seeing the man I had loved for 11 years turn into a stranger before my very eyes. The interrogation was just beginning, and the truth was about to tear his world apart, just as he had tried to tear mine. The man sitting across from Detective Reed looked like a ghost of the husband I once knew, his gray face reflecting a life built on a foundation of lies. Nathan sat in that sterile interrogation room, stammering through excuses about a stylist named Vanessa and a gift that was supposed to be a peace offering. He admitted he knew about my allergy, but claimed he never imagined a dress could be a weapon. However, when the detective brought up the forensic evidence, the triple concentration of azo dyes, and the manual application of formaldehyde, Nathan's composure shattered like glass. He admitted to being $25,000 in debt, drowning in credit cards and private loans, and in a moment of terrifying silence, he realized he had already confessed to seeing my death as a financial exit strategy. Vanessa Pierce entered the precinct the following day, a woman whose stylish exterior couldn't mask the calculated coldness in her eyes. She didn't flinch when she admitted to a year-long romantic relationship with my husband. She spoke of Nathan with a chilling lack of regret, claiming he had promised to divorce me so they could be together. She admitted to buying the dress at his specific request, down to the exact brand and color he had seen in a photo. But when the conversation turned to the chemical treatment of the fabric, she retreated into a shell of denial, claiming she was just a lover caught in a mess she didn't understand. The breakthrough that finally sealed their fate came from a gray-suited man named Dr. Ethan Coleman. A week after the first round of questioning, he stood in the detective's office with microscopic photographs that told a story of pure malice. The dyes hadn't been applied by a machine in a factory. They were concentrated in specific spots on the inner lining where the fabric would most likely rub against my skin. It was a surgical, professional application of poison. Dr. Coleman's investigation led the police to a chemical supplier and an agent who identified Vanessa Pierce as the woman who had purchased the rare, industrial-grade azo died just 1 month prior. The evidence was an iron cage from which they could not escape. When Vanessa was brought back in and confronted with the agent's testimony and the microscopic proof, her loyalty to Nathan evaporated. She confessed everything in a flood of words that made my blood run cold. They had planned it together. Nathan had provided the target, my life-threatening allergy, and Vanessa had provided the means. They calculated that I would wear the dress immediately and that the anaphylactic shock would be so swift and severe that an ambulance would never reach me in time. It was supposed to look like a tragic accident, a freak occurrence that would leave Nathan as the grieving, wealthy heir to my pharmacy empire. The only thing they hadn't planned for was the genuine enthusiasm of a sister-in-law. Claire's impulsive decision to try on that dress had unintentionally dismantled a murder plot. When Nathan learned of Claire's attack, the realization that his plan had backfired sent him into a spiral of defensive lies, but it was far too late. The phone records revealed over 30 calls between the lovers during the weeks of preparation, and the financial trail of Nathan's mounting debts provided the perfect motive. I stood in my bedroom that evening, looking at the closet that still held Nathan's clothes. They felt like the discarded skin of a monster. Every item of his was now a reminder of a man who didn't see me as a person, but as a barrier to the inheritance he craved. David Harper called me to confirm that after the confrontation with Vanessa, Nathan had finally admitted his guilt. He confessed to the conspiracy, the greed, and the cold-blooded coordination that went into selecting a murder weapon made of silk and thread. The legal process moved forward with a relentless, mechanical speed. I filed for divorce immediately, ensuring that Nathan would never see another cent of the property he had tried to kill for. The court was swift in its judgment. Given the circumstances, the property division was entirely in my favor. I sold our apartment, unable to breathe in a place that held the echoes of his betrayal, and bought a new home in a quiet neighborhood where the air felt clean and the memories were fresh. In the months leading up to the trial, I focused on my business. With the support of my partner, Gregory Barnes, I managed to open a 4th pharmacy. Work became my sanctuary, and Claire became my constant companion. We spent our evenings talking about the future, carefully avoiding the subject of the brother she had lost to greed. In January, just a week before the sentencing, a letter arrived from the jail. Nathan's handwriting was shaky, filled with excuses about collectors and a weakness that allowed Vanessa to push him toward a plan he claimed he now regretted. He said he saw my face when he imagined Claire suffocating and that he was ready to pay for his crimes. I read it once, then tucked it away in a drawer, not out of forgiveness, but as a final piece of evidence of his cowardice. The trial was a blur of professional testimony and cold facts. There was no room for negotiation. Nathan was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security prison, and Vanessa Pierce received 7 for her complicity. I sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read, looking at the man I had shared 11 years of my life with. I expected to feel rage, but all I felt was a profound, hollow emptiness. He was no longer the man I married. He was just a prisoner being led away in handcuffs. As I walked down the courthouse steps with David, the winter air felt sharp and invigorating. He asked me how I was doing, and I realized for the first time that the weight was truly gone. "I'm alive," I told him. And that's the only victory that matters. 6 months later, the fear has mostly receded. The emerald dress is a ghost that occasionally haunts my dreams, but the reality of my life is far brighter. I protected myself with a will and a power of attorney, but I saved myself with the truth. I survived a plot designed to erase me, and in doing so, I found a strength I never knew I possessed. The motive that nearly ended my life died the moment I took control of my own destiny, and now my life continues, vibrant, successful, and entirely my own.